In a public speaking class, the majority of the time is spent giving or listening to speeches, and less time is usually spent on how to give people comments on the speeches that they've given. Usually, that responsibility falls on the professor in the class. But it's important to know how to give people comments in any situation. And as you all know, the difference between getting your feelings hurt and not getting your feelings hurt isn't so much a matter of what's being said, but how it's being said. And if you look at the workplace, the difference between a good manager and one that's not so good isn't really what they say, but how they say it. So this is a quick tutorial on how to give feedback to others, both in a public speaking situation and also kind of out in the real world in an interpersonal setting. Before I get into any specific guidelines, one general rule of thumb with giving feedback to people is you need to make sure that it's well timed. Now, well timed doesn't mean when you feel like saying it, especially in an interpersonal setting. It really means when the other person is ready to hear it. So, in particular, if you're looking at a public speaking situation, if a person is unhappy with their performance, then you might not want to hit them with a whole bunch of coaching tips, right off the bat. You might want to wait a little bit. You also need to kind of gauge how much the person is ready and willing to listen to, because it might be that they are not. And in that case, you need to postpone those comments until a better time and just check back with the person. So really well timed means when the other person is ready to hear it, not when you're ready to say it. Because doing something other than that means that one person's going to be really unhappy, and it might be that you can't avoid someone being unhappy, or bothered by the comments that you're giving, but there's a better time than other times. So with that, let's move into some of the guidelines. There are 5. The first guideline is you want to make sure that your comments are specific and not general. In other words, you get really frustrated, I'm sure, when you get a paperback that says good job and doesn't give you any comments on what made it a good job. And so the idea behind giving people comments in public speaking isn't to say, hey, that was a great speech or good job, like the topic, but get really specific. Was there something about the visual aids you thought were intriguing? Was there something about their delivery and the way they moved and used gestures? Was there something about the content or the way they cited their sources? Instead of just saying good sources, you said, I really like the way you cited your sources. It made them feel very natural and conversational. So that's probably the biggest rule that I want to give you and why I listed it as the first one. The others are also important, however. The second is you want to make sure that your comments are based on the performance and not on the personality. And by that, I mean, you don't want to tell someone, it didn't look like you had time to do this, or your speech doesn't show that you really care about your topic, or you don't care about the class. That would be similar in an interpersonal situation saying, it's obvious you don't care about me. That's a personality comment, not a performance-based comment. So you want to look specifically at what behavior happened or what the person did and focus in on that. So if a person, didn't have a preview, it'd be very easy to say, I'm not sure I heard the preview of the main points. I'm not sure I heard that first, second, and third. Or if it's an interpersonal setting, it might be, I noticed that, that today that you didn't respond to my texts. That would be performance based instead of saying, what's the matter? Are you too busy to respond to my texts? So that would be what performance is, dealing specifically with what the person is doing, not your interpretation of what their attitude might be with that. The third guideline is make sure, and this is really difficult to do, but it's an ongoing process, is say I instead of you or we. So instead of saying you didn't have a preview, or you didn't cite your sources, or your speech wasn't long enough, you want to try to say I, because that way you don't have that kind of invisible implied finger pointing at somebody. So you'd say, I'm not sure I heard a preview, or I'd like to hear a preview, or I'd like to hear the sources that you had in your speech. I thought your speech was really compelling, and I want to know where that data came from because it was really good. And you also don't want to defer to we, we don't like what we're hearing, or, we don't like what you're doing, which would again be both a problem with specificity and also with the we sentence. So you always want to own your comments. And that then kind of sometimes puts people in check of how do I want to say this so that it sounds a little bit better. So this is, again, an ongoing process to say I instead of you or we. You also shouldn't say something like, I don't think you had a preview, because there's silly you in there. All right, the next one is really focusing on the future performance. And I have that in quotations because it doesn't mean performance like a public speaking performance, although that is really what this tutorial is about. But also in other situations, the performance would be whatever that person is doing. If they're not returning your calls, or if they make decisions for you, or they speak for you and you wish that you had had a chance to say something, you would always focus on the future. So like when you do the speech again, I might suggest some, stronger preview. If you do this speech again, try to incorporate some source citations, and it really bolsters your credibility when you do that. So that's the future, and it might be the same with, hey, just so that I know that we're on the same page. Is it possible to text me a little sooner, or can we touch base at some point so that we make sure that we're on the same page during the day? If that's again an interpersonal issue. So always sort of forecasting that this is going to be, when the person does this again, whether it's a speech or whether it's just interaction in general. And then finally, the last guideline is don't discredit yourself. And I hear this a lot because students don't want to be unkind and realize that giving comments to people isn't being unkind. I mean, it can be, but in its best light, it's really coaching tips. None of us are perfect communicators. Even speech professors will tell you that. I myself get clumsy sometimes in certain situations, and I just have to acknowledge I'm not. I'm having a clumsy moment here, and let me try to. I'm going to talk my way through this and try to say this as elegantly as possible. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, maybe it's just me. Maybe everybody else liked your speech. You don't want to say, maybe I just didn't hear it. Go ahead and say, I didn't hear it. And then the person can say, well, here's where it was. And then you can say, okay. I didn't hear it because I was distracted by something, or I think if the preview had been numbered correctly, numbered at all, then maybe I would have heard a little bit better. So don't apologize for anything that you need to say. Say it, and if it's coming from a place of concern and a place of love, then that feedback is for the most part fairly justifiable. So that would be the last guideline that I would say is don't discredit your own self and say, well, maybe I'm wrong here. Just say what you need to say, and then the person can always say, well, I'm glad you said that because I actually wasn't sure if I had that preview in that speech. So when you're in your speech class, if the instructor doesn't have an opportunity, many don't, for because of time or other issues, doesn't have time for you to give comments to your classmates, what you might want to do is pull a classmate aside or just say, hey, had some ideas for your speech on the way out. Don't discredit and say, well, I'm just a student or I'm just like you. Just go ahead and say, would you like to hear an idea that I had for you? So again, making sure it's well timed and then giving that comment. It might be that comment is really appreciated. And if it's not, then you still shared something that you thought might make a speech better. Might be the same again with a friend or a family member. You really have nothing to lose and everything to gain by trying to concentrate on giving feedback in a way that makes people feel like they're valued.